Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a big one, the history of the English language. We're going to trace its evolution from its earliest roots to the global language we know today. And joining us on this journey through time is a true language expert.
Thanks for having me. Excited to dig into this.
So before we even had English, what was going on linguistically in Britain?
Well, picture a real mix. Primarily Celtic languages. Think Pictish and what we call Brittonic. Now, Brittonic, that's not just one language. It's actually a whole branch. And, of course, you had some Latin hanging around from the Romans, but it wasn't exactly the dominant force anymore.
A real melting pot of languages. Then came the Anglo-Saxons, bringing their Germanic dialects. Those are the roots we see in English today, right?
Yeah.
Tell us about their arrival. What did they bring linguistically?
So it's around the 5th century, right? And you see these big migrations coming from mainland Europe to Britain. We're talking about areas we now know as Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, and they weren't speaking one unified language. It was more a collection of related dialects, what we call Ingvaeonic. As they settled and formed their kingdoms, one dialect, West Saxon, kind of rose to the top. That became the foundation for Old English.
So a gradual evolution as these dialects mixed, rather than a sudden takeover.
Exactly. Language change is rarely a clean break, more like a constant blending and adapting.
Now we can't forget about the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a goldmine of information, even if historians debate its total accuracy. What can it tell us about the language then? And maybe more interestingly, where does it fall short?
You hit the nail on the head with accuracy. The Chronicle, yeah, it's valuable, but it definitely has its biases and even some gaps. Take their accounts of battles, for example. Written from the victor's perspective, the Anglo-Saxons, of course, it tends to downplay their losses and, well, maybe exaggerate those of their enemies. It reminds us that language is never truly neutral. Whoever holds the pen controls the narrative. They shape how we see the past.
Powerful stuff. Even in something like historical records, language choices can reveal a lot about who had the power and what their agenda was. Now, as these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were finding their feet, another group of newcomers showed up with a language of their own, the Vikings. What did those Norse raiders do to the development of English?
Okay, so the Vikings, they had Old Norse, right? And they didn't completely replace Old English, and that's because Old Norse and Old English were kind of like linguistic cousins.
So more like distant relatives coming for a long visit. Did that make the transition smoother than, say, when the Anglo-Saxons arrived?
In some ways, yeah. Those shared roots, they allowed the languages to blend in ways we still see today.
So the Vikings weren't just fierce warriors, they were also accidental language influencers.
You got it. Even a simple word like may, that comes straight from Old Norse, and anger, take, even sky.
Wow, these everyday words we never think twice about have such deep historical roots.
And don't forget about place names. Ever traveling through England and see a town ending in bye-bye? Grimsby, Derby, that bye, that's Old Norse for farm or settlement, a sure sign of Viking influence.
So the Vikings left their mark, not just on the map, but on the language itself. They added words that are essential to English today. Now, before we move on, we have to talk about a huge turning point in the history of English, the Norman conquest. But we'll dive into that fascinating chapter in part 2 of our English language deep dive. Welcome back to our deep dive into the history of the English language. Last time, we left off on the brink of a pretty big shakeup. The Norman conquest, it really was a seismic event in the history of English.
Yeah, the linguistic earthquake might not even be an exaggeration.
Right. 1066, Anglo-Norman, that's a dialect of French, comes in and becomes the language of the courts, law, the elite. It's almost like English got pushed aside.
Yeah, language becomes a mark of social status. It's fascinating. For centuries after the conquest, English was the language of the common people, while French was for the powerful and prestigious. Kind of hard to imagine now, huh?
It really is. So how did this power dynamic, this linguistic divide, actually play out in everyday life?
What we see emerge is Middle English. This wasn't just a few French words sprinkled in. It was a huge shift. Grammar, pronunciation, vocabulary. Imagine listening to Middle English. You'd hear those Old English echoes, but also those French influences, especially in words about law, government, even food.
So justice, parliament, beef. We have the Normans to thank for those.
Exactly. These words, so central to English today, came in during this time of intense linguistic exchange.
Wow, even our culinary vocabulary reflects those power dynamics. It makes you wonder, do our ideas about fancy words versus everyday words come from this time, when different languages were associated with different social classes?
That's a really interesting connection. Language isn't just about communication. It's tied to social structures, power, all of that.
Now, on top of all these changes in vocabulary, grammar, wasn't there a big shift in pronunciation too? Something about vowels going on a wild ride?
You're talking about the Great Vowel Shift. It's a huge deal in the history of English pronunciation. Really changed how the language sounded.
So break it down for us. What happened? How did it change how English sounded?
Okay, so between the 14th and 17th centuries, the long vowel sounds in English, they underwent this massive transformation. And we're not talking about accents changing here. The whole vowel system got rearranged. Imagine going back in time to see Shakespeare performed. You'd probably barely understand it.
Seriously, Shakespeare, all those famous lines, and it sounded totally different.
Absolutely. He might need subtitles to understand his own plays today.
That just blows my mind. While this was happening, this huge shift in sound, another revolution was going on. The printing press. What did the printing press do to the evolution of English?
Total game changer. Before printing, books were copied by hand, which meant variations in spelling, even word choices were all over the place. But printing meant mass production, and that meant you needed to standardize English for consistency.
So the printing press didn't just change how books were made, it shaped the language itself.
Exactly. With the printing press came this big push for standardization, especially in spelling. And that's where dictionaries and grammar books take off. People wanted to set some rules, make sense of this changing language.
Out of all this change, this linguistic whirlwind, came this desire for order, consistency, and technology played a big part in that. We've gone from Old English to the Norman Conquest, through the Great Vowel Shift, seen the printing press, and now, as we hit the early modern period, English starts to make its way onto the world stage. But that's a story for part 3 of our English language deep dive.
And we're back, ready to round out our deep dive into the history of English.
We're in the early modern period now, a time of huge intellectual growth, exploration, global expansion, and all of that's going to leave its mark on the language. It's amazing to think about English along for the ride as explorers are discovering new lands and scholars are rediscovering ancient knowledge. Speaking of which, our sources mention this inkhorn debate happening around this time. What was that all about?
So the Incord debate, it was this linguistic battleground, basically. All these new words flooding into English.
That's overflowing.
Yeah, it's the Renaissance, right? Explosion of knowledge, science, art, philosophy. And scholars, writers, they need words for these new concepts. So they start borrowing from Latin, Greek, and not everyone's thrilled.
Ah, so you've got the innovators excited about new words, and then the purists who want to keep English pure, whatever that means.
Exactly. These new words, inkhorn terms they were called, some people thought they made the language too difficult, too obscure for everyday people.
Sounds like an argument we still have today. Slang, jargon, language, always changing.
For sure. How much change is good? How much tradition do you try to hold on to? It's an ongoing tension.
Definitely. And while all this is happening, English is starting to spread beyond those island borders. It's becoming a global language. How did that impact its evolution?
So England's influence is growing.
Mm-hmm.
Exploration, colonization, trade. And English, it becomes the language of commerce, diplomacy, administration in the colonies.
So it wasn't just along for the ride, it was shaping and being shaped by these global encounters.
Exactly. This age of globalization, it's huge for English. New words, phrases, even grammatical structures coming in from everywhere.
English, the ultimate borrower. It can take on influences, adapt, but still keep its core identity.
And we can't forget about the people trying to keep track of it all. The lexicographers, people like Samuel Johnson. His dictionary, published in 1755, it was a landmark event.
I mean, trying to pin down all the words in the English language at that time, it's incredible.
Monumental undertaking. Really shows you how much effort goes into defining, standardizing this ever-changing language.
Well, that brings us to the end of our journey. From those early Germanic roots to this global language. What a story. Invasion, adaptation, borrowing innovation. It really shows you how dynamic language is always changing.
And the story doesn't end here.
Exactly. English, as quirky and complex as it is, it's still evolving. New words, old words taking on new meanings, technology, culture, they all shape how we communicate. So, what will the English language look like, sound like in 100 years? 200. It's a question worth thinking about. To all our listeners out there, speakers, writers, word nerds, keep exploring, keep playing with this amazing language. A huge thanks to our expert for joining us on this incredible journey through the history of English.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time.